Hello, everyone, and welcome back to More Than a Muse. I'm Stauney.
And I'm Sadie. Welcome back. We have a very fun episode here today that I'm very excited about. Wow, we are both matching our walls perfectly with the
Oh,
shirts that we wore
yeah.
today.
We'll just
Wow,
blend in.
fully blending in to our live studio today. Wow. Anyways,
Lovely.
happy to be back. We took a week off to recoup from our March Madness, and we're
hmm
back in business though, and I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. Obviously, Disney's been in the headlines, so we had
Yes.
to talk about it in a more affectionate way. Excited to talk about it that way.
Did you see the new Snow White movie?
No, I have heard some things that people were like, it's not as bad as everyone was saying it was.
I honestly haven't felt the desire to seek out a Disney live action in a hot second.
I think the last one I went to was Lion King. And the opening sequence, like, made my jaw drop because it was, like, frame by frame recreation
Mhm.
of the original, so I was like, "This is amazing," and then they ruined it.
Oh, not a great sell then.
No, it was very disappointing. Yeah,
I can't even remember the last one that I went and sought out on my own besides
yeah.
the original Cinderella. I
Which was so
saw
good.
I know that one was amazing. I saw
Amazing.
the Aladdin movie, but like my
Yeah.
family was watching it and I was just gonna be a
Yep.
good sport.
Yeah,
But
and I liked The Little Mermaid, nothing
oh,
wrong
I
with it.
did see The Little Mermaid. That one was fine.
It was
It was
cute,
cute.
but, like, I don't know, the original Cinderella, I think, just set my expectations so high because it was
So high.
so incredible, and then everything else after is just kinda not
Everything
really
else, they're
hit.
trying too hard to like, they can't figure out that line between, I don't know, having it match the original, but also be original on its own. And it just,
Yeah,
they haven't stuck the landing.
they
I think
haven't.
everyone's just tired of a remake. We want original ideas.
Beauty and the Beast was good.
I never saw that. I wouldn't
Oh,
know.
it was good. I liked the music they wrote for it.
Oh, yeah, I heard the
The
new songs are fine.
dress was disappointing.
Well, let's talk. If we're going to talk about disappointing dresses, we can look at Snow White's.
Yeah. Way
That was
more
appalling.
disappointing. But once again, Cinderella just set the bar way too high on that one
Truly.
because holy crap.
It was
Like,
beautiful.
it is so pretty.
Oh,
Plus her wedding dress. Like everyone talks about the blue one. Go look at the wedding dress again.
is beautiful.
So pretty. In our newsletter, if you are signed up for that, we did a bit about that this week. And I brought up Mirror, which if you're looking for a good Snow White adaptation,
That's a great one.
highly recommend Mirror Mirror. It
Mhm.
does have Armie Hammer in it, but
Ew.
it's such a good adaptation. And then there's
Yeah.
also Snow White and then Huntsman with Kristen Stewart
yeah.
and is it Chris Hemsworth?
I don't remember.
And that one was like a little darker, but also very phenomenal. You
They
want a
exist.
feminist
It's possible to do a good live action Snow White.
Yes, with even
Disney
a
just
feminist
couldn't do
take,
it.
strong female character.
Yeah.
They didn't manage it. It's hard too because I'm like, I feel like Snow White gets a lot of interesting discourse surrounding it because technically, according to canon or whatever, she's 14, which is,
Oh, I didn't know that.
I think the prince was also like really young.
Okay.
And
Just a teenage
if you
love story
remember,
then.
everyone's always, he just swoops in at the end and kisses her and then they go get married. You watch, they
No.
meet at the beginning.
They know who each other are.
Yes.
And she does amazing work as an independent woman to get herself out of there,
Yes.
make friends with people through her pure good heart.
It teaches the dwarves kindness and cleanliness, both
Yeah.
important things.
Very important things.
And then they literally run the witch off of a cliff and she dies. Does no one
Yeah,
remember that from the original one?
It's
She
pretty
literally
dark.
falls off and
off a
then
cliff.
vultures come
Yeah.
down and swoop
Oh
after
my
her.
gosh. There is a terrifying female villain in that original one. Very strong
Oh,
female
yeah.
character. And then Snow White.
Man. But the fun part about that original Snow White, we actually get to talk about it a little bit because we're talking about the role that women played in animation in early Disney, which is something we've touched on a little bit. Our Millicent Patrick episode from 2 Halloweens ago, she worked in the ink and paint department in early Disney. And then I also did an episode on Mary Blair, who is famous for the It's a Small World ride. And she also worked with Disney in the early days, but unsurprisingly, or surprisingly, depending on how you look at it, they were not the only women in
Yeah.
Disney in the early days. There were a lot more. So we get to dive into what life was like working on Snow White and working in the ink and paint department and all of the women that contributed. So, obviously, it all begins with Walt because he was the beginning of the whole thing. Behind him and everything else that there was so many women involved in the beginning of Walt Disney. So, originally, when Disney started with their animation and then all the other departments that went along with that, women were not allowed in the animation department. There was like a couple of reasons. Obviously, sexism was one of them. So there's this article from the Walt Disney Family Museum page, I think, or something, like run by the Walt Disney family. And it says, if you were a man blessed with both creativity and artistic talent, you held a spot in the animation department. But if you were a woman with the same skills, the only department you were open for you at that time was the ink and paint. This type of job restriction could be found not only at Disney, but also every other studio of that kind. They obviously were like the biggest animation studio at the time, I would say, for sure. They probably would have had more sway in the industry if would have done something different.
They could have set a precedent that they chose not to.
Yeah, but it wasn't like, this is the way it's going to be. There were kind of some precedents there. Animation was just considered a man's medium. The men most famous for the role in early Disney were called the 9 Old Men. And literally, if you search animators in early Disney, these 9 old men are going to come up.
Interesting.
And these 9 old men were just the legendary group of core animators who helped shape the golden age of Disney animation. They worked in the studio from the 1920s until the 1980s. Pretty
long
prominent.
time.
The Walt Disney was the one who named them the 9 Old Men. That included Les Clark, Mark Davis, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, Mick Hale, Ward Kimball, Eric Larson, John Lonesberry, and Wooly Reithenman. And they were responsible for the animation behind most of the iconic beginning films. You have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Rescuers, and then they also played key roles in theme park design, character development, and mentoring the next generation of animators who took over when they left. They all have been given the prestigious Winsor McKay Award and have all been collectively named Disney Legends. And the last one actually just passed away in 2008. So they are the people that get the credit, that come up all the time. And then, of course, Disney as well himself. But I found a Vanity Fair article too that was talking about this lady who interviewed her aunt about her job at early Disney and then ended up being able to talk to a lot of her aunt's coworkers and getting a glimpse into what it was like working with these 9 old men in the early days of Disney. And in her article, she said, but if behind every good man stands a good woman, behind Walt Disney and his boys, the all-male assembly line once stood 100 women.
Wow.
And that was the ink and paint department just in the early days. It obviously would grow 100, at least 100. And then most of these women were also under 25 years old.
Whoa.
And they were responsible for basically coloring the entire film, which became very important when they started doing full-length feature films in all color. Steamboat Willie and such wouldn't have had that, but when you go to do a movie like Snow White or Pinocchio, where Jiminy Cricket required 27 different colors on his tiny little body, I don't know why Walt Disney decided to make it so complicated, but it looks beautiful. So 27 colors for a tiny cricket it is. They were responsible to make everything that the men did look good. So the way that this article described the positions was actually really cool because it gives the assembly line a breakdown of what's happening. So obviously, it doesn't work exactly how it used to anymore for good reason. So the way that they would do a story or a movie, I guess you could say, so how Snow White began, is that apparently Walt Disney himself would act out the whole story, how he imagined it in his head, to these men and then sketch artists. And they would start to find things that would pull at the heartstrings or create a good story and start pulling that out and creating sketches and everything from it. Obviously, a lot of those original Disney stories, and even a lot of them now, come from the Brothers Grimm or like mythology and fairy tales, which have a lot of European roots in both story and style, which, you know, is why a lot of Disney in the beginning wasn't very diverse. But then they would create a script and refine it and then do storyboards or visual images of the scenes, just like really quick ones that they would pin up and then create further narrative possibilities. Then they would pass it on to the music department, who would begin to plan the overall look of the film while music was starting to work on the composition of the soundtrack and all of the musical numbers. And then the directors and layout man obviously would start working on that. And then the background department would concentrate on individual settings. So they were the ones working on like the castles or the woods. And then the special effects men would tackle challenges of waves, water, storms, all of the things that moved and required a lot more precision and care in making sure it looked
Mhm.
realistic. Then you would have the actors recording the voice track, and then the animators were obviously responsible for every single character, whether human or animal, to be developed and drawn in pencil. The way that this would work is they would have the main animator draw out the character and then pass it on to an in-between animator who would
Okay.
then draw every little movement in between the major poses.
Whoa.
Because animation, if you remember when you were little, seeing those like little flip books to draw every single little movement, that's a lot for a single step or a dance or anything. It requires so many individual frames, and they're not going to have the main animator draw every single bit of that. So the main poses and then the in between stages were then cleaned up and clarified by another animator who would draw
Wow.
literally so many.
So many. Yeah.
I don't
Already.
even know how many, so many different little in between scenes. But then all of this had to be passed off to the ink and paint department for them to color in every
Wow.
single bit of it. From those background scenes to the waves to the character movements and every little in between scene, all had to be colored in seamlessly to
Mhm.
match so that they could make their motion picture. And every drawing was on these regulation size sheets of celluloid. And then the drawings were placed under cells with one L. And then, after careful checking, the cells were distributed to the painters who would put the paint on the reverse side. And then they were not allowed to slip over those. The ink lines had to stay dominant. So they had to make sure that the paint stayed perfectly within the ink lines. They would also have hundreds of shades of paint, which were made in the studio laboratory, which was next to the ink and paint building. And then after they did a final check to make sure that the cell layers listed on the exposure sheet were in place and registered to the backgrounds, the work faces the studio camera where they would film it all happening. And then it would be sent to the Technicolor plant for finishing, where they were able to put it all together into a film. So it's kind of
Whoa.
weird to think about it, where they were like filming drawings
Yeah.
and then that became a movie, but that's how it would work. The ink and painters obviously were very large. They would need a lot of people in order to paint in every single scene for all of these. So they would have rows and rows of assigned desks with gooseneck lamps and hard-backed chairs. Apparently, you were allowed to bring a pillow, which is
Perfect.
next. And they would line up next to the high windows that offered the California light. And they tried to keep from talking because speed and accuracy were closely monitored. One of the ink and painters actually confessed that sometimes she would just drop her board on the floor just so that it would make some noise to break up the silence. Very relatable.
Yep.
And the inking and painting boards and camera beds had the same bottom peg anchoring system so that it wouldn't like the problem when they went from inking and painting to camera, like things wouldn't shift. And the inkers' boards were raked while painters' boards were flat so that the paint wouldn't run down. And the inking girls had to work with the Gillette 290 nibs, which are the thinnest available, and then ebony pointers to keep the work from slipping, and color models, which were these reference sheets with the approved paints that were allowed for each of the characters.
Oh, uh-huh.
Because they weren't picking what they
Mhm.
wanted to. It had all been pre-approved. I talked about there were some characters that were beloved for how easy they were, as opposed to other ones which were a lot more difficult. They said Pluto was easy to ink because he had nice long lines.
Nice.
Goofy's face was also easy for the same reason, but a lot of people hated Mickey Mouse because they couldn't do the ears in one stroke.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
And the other issue with it too is that like you couldn't let the ink layer. So, well, they would ink and then the paint couldn't layer either. So, you know how sometimes you're drawing with a marker and then if you go on top of it after it's
Yeah.
dried, it creates that like layered effect where some of it's darker. They can't have that happen because it breaks up the animation and it shows the brush strokes. So they have to do all of it as fast as possible before the paint dries, or
Oh my
else
gosh.
it has a flaw and it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
So they're like filling it in as fast as possible. Inkers were often considered the queens because they had to do the stippling and colored ink to outline everything. So you've got like shimmering tails of the mermaids or transparent fins of fish, sparkling water, or Tinkerbell's fairy dust. And then
Wow.
you also have the painters, though, that they were the ones making sure that nothing streaked, which honestly sounds way harder, in my opinion, than
Yeah.
inking the painting for sure. One of them said my most unfavorite colors were gray and purple because they streaked. And she was working with the whale in Pinocchio, which is
Mm-hmm.
all gray and purple. And she said she accidentally, on her first assignment, painted the whole thing on the wrong side of the cell. She was so worried she was going to be fired on the spot. And then she said, but I went to see it at the Pantages Theater. They had used the scene, but disguised it as a rainstorm. So they like turned her whale into a rainstorm.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Which also I think goes to show like kind of the limits they were under. They literally couldn't waste any time. The amount of time she had spent on that, they had to turn it into something because it was so many resources that like they couldn't just not
Now I wanna go
use.
back and rewatch that scene. I've never felt a desire to go and rewatch that creepy movie, but now
I
I would like to
know.
go watch that.
Pinocchio is very creepy. And then also, the girls would be the ones to spot errors in like the animation. Apparently, there's like
Mhm.
a little animal in Rite of Spring in Fantasia that was supposed to walk onto water, but ended up like floating away in the sky. So now I'm like, I don't know if that's still in there, but that's funny.
That's
And
funny.
then Walt was also very happy with creative solutions that all of the departments would come up with. The painters thought that Snow White's cheeks were too pale, and so they came up with this blend that they used to give her little rosy cheeks. And
Mhm.
then they were also the ones who added in little highlights to her black hair because they thought it was too dull. This all
Hmm.
became a part of her character design. On the 1942 feature Saludos Amigos, the inkers actually devised this contraption where they would work with 4 pens at once tied by rubber bands in order to get twice as much done in order to do all of the lines, which I'm like, how would that even work?
Amazing.
Yeah, that's how it works. In the early years, paints were given numbers and not names, except for one color that they had affectionately named Roy, which was this beigey brown that they named after the guy who washed their nitrate cells.
Oh, funny.
So that was his color. And then later on, after the studio moved to Burbank, California, having a color named for you would become an accolade or an honor a
Oh,
lot of the
cool.
times. Yeah, if you worked with a color or something or perfected it, they would name it after you,
Sweet.
which sounds a lot easier to me than numbers. So I'm glad that came from
Yeah.
because, yeah, that's a lot to remember. Once the paint was dry, they would have to do airbrushing for the cheek tones or puffy clouds, obviously, to get that like perfect
Mhm.
airy look effect. And then there was also dry brushing, which was for like speed lines. Once again, the pixie dust, or in order to make it look, I don't even know how to explain, to make it look like smoke or pixie dust.
Yeah, cool.
And then specialists would finish up. They were doing an average of 8 to 10 cells an hour, which sounds like nothing. So that sucks.
Shows how
And then
meticulous they had to be.
and that's 100 girls could only turn out less than 1 minute of screen time by the end of the day.
Oh my gosh. So that's, like, when they really couldn't redo anything. Like,
They were
their
getting a
resources were so
minute of
limited.
screen time done in their, like,
Wow.
8-hour shift, which is horrible. They did have it a little bit better off, I think, than the animators because Disney did have a soft spot for the women. They would have a uniformed maid serve them tea and Lorna Doones, which are shortbread cookies, every single
Cute.
day at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to give them a break. And they would often go out and enjoy it on the lawn. And very often they would fall asleep during these 15-minute breaks, which can't really blame them. One of the reasons specifically why they ended up picking men for animation and women for ink and paint is in order to be like a senior member of ink and paint, it took you 5 years, I think. And a lot of the times they would refer to themselves as a first year, a second year, a third year. Very like high school-esque, which is kind of
Yeah.
funny because a lot more of that comes into that too. And animation took 10, which
Mm.
is fair. It's a more not necessarily complicated process, but it does require, I guess you could say, like, a higher level of skill in some ways because 'cause you're doing, like, character design
Mm,
instead of just the very meticulous work of ink and paint. And apparently Disney was having some issues where they had some early animators that were women that would then go and get married and quit halfway
mm,
or more than halfway through their training. And then they have all this time that they had spent training someone who then wasn't there anymore. So it is a time
it's
thing,
unfortunate.
which isn't great. So once again, it's hard because you want to be like, well, they could have been better. But then at the same time, you're like, the expectations of the time period were that most women didn't work the intensive careers after they got married. And this was very intensive, long shifts. It had a lot of upsides and downsides, but I think the ink and paint department was very intense. The camera department actually started complaining that there would be like dandruff or like fluff or something from the outfits that they wore on the cells because they were required to dress up for work. So they were
Mm,
like dresses, pearls, high heels, or like flared pants and slip-on shoes that Katharine Hepburn had worn, and like makeup every single day. And when the camera department gave these complaints, they still had to dress up for work, but then they would have a smock that they would put on over the top of their outfits in order to prevent that from happening. And then they also had these white cotton gloves, and they would cut off the thumb and the first two fingers on their working hand so they could like better do their work without getting anything on the cells. And one of them even talked about the fact that they were terrified outside of their job to like bowl, smoke, or drink because they were worried that their hands would start to shake and it would ruin their job, which I think is definitely artist anxiety for sure. Ones that are like,
totally.
would you rather lose your hands or your
Mm,
time? I'm like, legs.
yep.
I need my hands. And even though they were forbidden from fraternizing with the men because they were supposed to have separate lives, in the early days of Disney, especially with Snow White, there was a lot of proximity and a lot of animators and ink and painters ended up falling in love.
Nice.
They would meet out on the lawn in the shade. And he said, one of the husbands of one of the girls, we used to fraternize out on the little lawn in front of the studio and look at the pretty girls. And he was a Donald Duck expert, apparently. Which, can you
Amazing.
imagine how fun the job titles would have been back then? You're
Donald
like,
Duck expert. Yeah.
and his wife apparently even would go on to become a nude model for the studio art classes. So
Nice.
they were looking at the pretty girls. It was like high school, they often said as well. They even had ping pong and badminton and picnics and tennis. But all
Cute.
of them were so tired that they said most of the time they would just fall into bed every single night. And most of the junior staff had to take advantage of these 50-cent meal tickets that were offered instead of pay when they worked late
Oh,
so that they could go and get a meal across the street at the drugstore.
oh my gosh.
They had no time off and no expectation of any until after Snow White was finished. This was all during Snow White, very intensive. There was even a
Mhm.
couple of weeks where the girls weren't paid because things were running so far behind.
Oh my
And
gosh.
Walt himself joked that he had to mortgage Mickey and Minnie in order to make it happen
Oh no.
because it got really intense for a while there. So one of the ink and painters even wrote to her boyfriend in a letter that Snow White had to be out by Christmas. If not, it'll be too bad for the Disneys. She was only 20 years old and she was barely to keep her eyes opened after a month of working weekends and double shifts in the ink and paint department during the final push on Snow White. The minute I
Wow.
got a pen in my hand, my brain goes numb, just like it does at the studio. And she said, don't be upset if I start inking ducks and mice on the
Oh
letter
my
because,
gosh.
because they were working so hard. It was expensive, obviously. It's in order to create a film like that. And Mickey and Mouse and Donald Duck films that were even just shorts, like
Mhm.
the famous Disney shorts that they would show at the
Yep.
beginning, were becoming more and more expensive every time because, like anything, it's a craft and they wanted to improve on it. And so every time you improve, it gets more complicated and then it gets more
Mhm.
expensive. And they had hired Walt's brother to help them figure everything out. So they would call him the math magician because he was basically trying to figure out the numbers of everything they would need.
Mhm.
Couldn't shrink the 6 months of preparation, thousands of cells, and like the 2-week shoots that all of these things required in order to create an hour-long film like Snow White. Just had never been done before also, like a full-length animated film. They were worried that Snow White wouldn't be able to hold audiences' attention because no one had ever tried to show an entire audience a fairy tale cartoon for more than an hour. So
Mhm.
no one would even know if this would work, which adds to the whole thing. But they said that everyone by the end, especially the Ink Paint girls, were thin and exhausted. Like,
That's so
just
sad.
like, yeah. One of them said, I'll be so thankful when Snow White is finished and I can live like a human once again. She had recorded 85 hours in a week.
Oh my gosh.
We would work like little slaves and everybody would go to sleep wherever they were. She was one of only 2 left-handers in the department who had to learn everything backwards, which just adds to a whole other level of complexity. A painter said, I would see the moonrise, the sunrise, the moonrise, and the sunrise all during one shift.
Wow.
Um, she said that when long days would merge into nights, she would go home and take her clothes off, be in the closet, and then couldn't figure out, am I going to sleep or am I getting up? Because of how long it had been. What was crazy though is that even though all of these painters and junior animators were obviously the backbones of the film during the majority of the really grueling hard work, they
Mhm.
weren't invited to the Snow White Star-Studded premiere because, like I said, very expensive, and they were obviously
Yeah.
trying to make a statement. So they had invited a bunch of like celebrities. You have Clark Gable and Carol Lombard, and stories about them tearing up. And the tickets were a whopping $5.50. So they couldn't afford to go.
Oh my gosh.
But eventually, Walt Disney was able to give the staff tickets for Christmas Eve and then have a thank you party at the club where they were all invited. You did have to pay if you wanted to stay overnight, but they were all invited to go.
That's whatever. We'll take it.
They were doing their best. And this was all before they moved to Burbank, when later it got a little bit more illegal for men and women to fraternize with one another. And the ink and paint department would eventually be called the nunnery, affectionately, because they were not supposed to fraternize as much as they had been. But a lot of people did continue to claim that Disney was a romantic paradise for young women employees and for the amount of
Wow.
studio romances and marriages that far exceeded any other studio. So you go, Disney
Huh.
magic
There we
working
go.
working its charm.
We love
Um
Disney magic.
a few more little things and then I'll let you move on to the people. There's so much, you guys. Obviously, there's been a lot of books about this, and even this Vanity Fair article is amazing. It has a lot more about all of the different time periods of all of it. But apparently, to start working in ink and paint, they were recruiting from colleges, and Disney was like begging people because they needed people who were trained because it was a completely new art form and they needed people more than anything. They just needed hands, like enough people to do it. And your trial, though, was 5 unpaid months and then weekly elimination days. So every single week they would eliminate more people and
Oh
they
my
would
god.
they would judge them all on accuracy and speed and meticulously review everything because they had to have you be incredible, accurate, and fast in
That's
order to make it.
crazy.
And out of the class of 60, they only hired 3 people. Yeah, there was no rooms for mistakes. And the starting salary was only $16 a week. And to put that in comparison, animators at the time were making 100,
Oh
I think.
no.
Yeah, so it was not a lot of money. A lot of people, though, they said what they lacked in experience or education they made up for in Moxie, and that was a lot of it. They just were willing to do it. One of the girls said that she was living with her mother and struggling to pay the rent, and she said she didn't know the first thing about inking, but she went out, bought art paper, India ink, and a pen, found out where the studio is, walked in one day and said, I want a job. Do you have any work? And they put her
Oh.
to work. And
Wow.
obviously, pretty privilege could get you further. One of the girls said that she found out she had been hired because she looked healthy. So they figured that she could stand up under the overtime. So, like, okay,
Crazy.
she doesn't look like she'll fall apart. So we'll hire her.
Oh my gosh.
And then if you were more attractive, that you did a lot for a young male hiring team.
There we go.
Yeah, some of the people would even say, I don't care if you can draw or not, we'll teach you what we want you to do. And they would.
There we go.
Disney himself even found his wife in the ink and paint department, which I didn't know. Her name was Lillian Bounds, and she was from Idaho. She'd moved to Los Angeles and got a job at the Walt Disney Studio. And her initial role was working with ink and paint on the animated cells. And when he met her, he was very drawn to her and ended up hiring her as his personal secretary so he could have her closer by.
Wow.
And their relationship blossomed, and they were married on July 13th in 1925 in Idaho, in her hometown. And she's
Wow.
actually credited for naming Mickey Mouse a
Cool.
train trip from New York to California in 1928, and he showed her a drawing of the cartoon mouse and told her he was going to name it Mortimer.
Oh,
And
I have heard this.
she responded and was like, "That's depressing. You should name it Mickey." And so he did. And there's a lot of like
Great
little
call.
odes to her throughout the Disney parks. It's very cute. He named a little live steam locomotive scale model at the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad after her, the Lily Bell. And
Cute.
then there is like a parlor car at the Disney Railroad that's named the Lily Bell in her honor. And the Walt Disney World Railroad has a locomotive named Lily Bell. So it just huge. She has all these trains named after her throughout the parks.
That's so wholesome.
And then, of course, she was also inducted into the Disney Legends in 2003 because she was such a monumental part. We wouldn't have Mickey without her. We would have Mortimer, which is more depressing.
Don't like it.
So, yeah, she made the right call. But yeah, it was insane. Things got crazier when they had to switch to the Burbank studio. Apparently, like, Walt used to know all of the ink and painters. He would have them on a first name basis. They would have swim parties at his home. They were all like this family. And by the time that this aunt from the Vanity Fair article started working and like things became the nunnery over in Burbank, the studio had about 500 employees and Disney didn't know who half of them were. Which is fair. They scaled really big. Snow White was very successful. It got very large. And obviously, Disney is a monster company now. It is incomparable to those early days of what they were doing. But yeah,
Totally.
very grueling, intense work. Their days would start at 4:30 a.m. and go clear into the night.
All for those Disney classics. Amazing.
Yes. All for originally Snow White and then all of the other ones.
All of the other ones.
Yeah.
Amazing. So the first woman that I'm going to talk about, her name is Retta Scott, and she is actually the first woman to receive screen credit as a Disney animator for her work on Bambi, and particularly the hunting dog sequence, which is really cool. So she was born February 23rd of 1916, and she spent a lot of her time as a young girl, spending her time sketching wildlife at the nearby Griffith Park Zoo. She actually wanted to she wanted to have a career in the fine arts. She went to an art institute, and while she was there, she was urged to apply to work for Walt Disney based on her passion for animation. And she was actually initially apparently uninterested because the cartoon shorts that the company was known for, she wasn't interested. But her director recommended her anyways to work on Bambi, which was a full film, which was in current production. And she joined the company in 1938 to work in the story department. She actually worked on the storyboards to develop scenes of Bambi, his mother, and the film's hunting dogs, on which she spent weeks to develop them into vicious, snarling, really mean beasts. What's crazy is that male artists in the company were apparently like stunned because they initially assumed that only a man could create such drawings of such intensity and technical skill. But no, a woman can do it. And her
Yeah.
sketches actually caught the eye of Disney. So when the film went into production, she was assigned to animate the scenes of the hunting dogs chasing Baleen. And she worked under the film's supervising director, David D. Hand, and was tutored by the Disney animator Eric Larson. What's interesting, apparently there was like a coup for the young women, since at the 1930s era Disney studio, women, as you have mentioned, were considered for the routine ink and paint department, and it was very much like you said, the very meticulous things. Her promotion to animator was in part thanks to the success of herself and the other women, such as Bianca Majoli, Sylvia Holland, and Mary Blair, as storyboard artists. So even after assuming a promotion to animator, she and her animations continued being underappreciated in the industry. Though the most recognized Walt Disney female artist is Mary Blair, it is Retta Scott who opened up the doors for women in the animation industry because, like I
Yeah.
said, she's the first credited animator in Walt Disney, which is really
Which
cool.
is funny, honestly, that Mary Blair gets so much credit because she wasn't an animator. She was a story.
Yes.
Yeah, episode about her. She didn't do animation. She did the
Mhm.
storyboarding.
But yeah, she became the first woman to receive the screen credit as an animator. And by the spring of 1941, she was also considered a specialist in animal sketches. She would go on to help produce Fantasia and Dumbo, as well as an adaptation of The Wind in the Willows that ended up being later canceled. I think there's a couple of these women that this will make note of, but she was laid off in 1941. There was a lot of
Mhm.
them that was laid off at that time, but she was quickly rehired at 1942 and would assist in educational videos and some like smaller scale shorts. And like I said, the reason why she was laid off, I think, was because there was a strike in the summer of
Mm.
1941. And she wasn't involved in the strike, but she was still one of the ones that was laid off. But then she retired August 2nd, 1946. She married a submarine commander named Benjamin Worcester and became Retta Scott Worcester. And her husband moved to Washington, D.C., where she illustrated books such as the Santa Claus book and Happy Birthday. And she also continued working with Disney through freelance jobs and
Nice.
illustrated the big golden book edition of Disney's Cinderella. Her work caught the attention of past and current Disney employees, including Jonas Riviera, producer of Up, who commented, "I've always loved the Retta Scott Cinderella because it doesn't look like the movie, but somehow it feels like the movie,"
I
which
love
I think is such a
that.
high compliment about someone's art.
Yeah, I was gonna mention earlier and then I forgot, but one thing to note is that they did start letting women be a part of the animation.
Yeah,
First
eventually.
large part because of the Great Depression, and they were worried that all of the men would get drafted and they wouldn't have anyone trained. And then also Disney made a statement where he was like, "As well as the fact that women should be allowed to pursue all of the same things as men."
Oh, sure.
But yeah, but a lot of these women that you're gonna talk about are the reason why that even was able to be
Yeah,
possible.
that's amazing. This next woman is Yo Fujikawa, who's actually an early Japanese artist that was at Disney. And she was an American illustrator, but also a children's book writer, and has 50 children books to her name and to her art. And her work is like still continued in regular reprint, has been translated into 17 languages, published in 22 countries. Her most popular books are actually Babies and Baby Animals, that has sold over 1.7 million copies in the US and is recognized for being the earliest mainstream illustrator of picture books to include children of many races in her work before it became common to do, which I think is really cool.
Yes.
She moved to Los Angeles to attend the Chouinard Art Institutes in 1926. And after graduated and spending a year in Japan, she was on the faculty of that art institute from 1933 to 1937. She actually worked for Walt Disney Company in California as a promotional artist before moving to New York in 1941. What's very tragic is she actually had to avoid the forced internment of West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II as she was living
Ugh,
in New York City at the time, which is why she moved out of
gosh.
California. I
Yeah.
know. Her family actually spent the war in the camp in Arkansas, which is just crazy
It
and
went
so
that
sad.
far? I
Mhm.
literally thought it was just West Coast. Arkansas is not on the West Coast.
No, and I don't know if, like, they sent them to Arkansas from the West Coast, like, if that's just where the
Oh,
camp, but yeah,
to be
really tragic.
honest,
That's why she had to stop working for Disney and move to New York City to
yeah,
escape
I'm like,
that.
that's kind of a blind area, I feel like, of history for me,
Yeah.
so,
I
yeah.
think that our education system did a really good point in doing that, a major point in
Yes.
that.
We've talked about this. The United States loves nothing more than to be a hero, so anytime we look bad, they don't cover
They
it
don't
very
acknowledge
much.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And during that time from 1943 to 51, she actually worked for a pharmaceutical advertising agency just during the war. But then in 1951, she became a full time freelancer. And that's when she really turned to her children's stories. She produced more than 80 front cover illustration for Children's Digest. And then about 5 years later was approached by an editor to illustrate A Child's Garden of Verses. And that was her first published children's book, and then that just continued on, and that's really where she got a lot of success There's actually a playwright named Lloyd Sue scripted a one-act play imagining a dialogue between Walt Disney and Fujikawa titled Disney and Fujikawa that was actually performed at the Ensemble Studio Theater in New York City in 2017. So I thought that was a really cool thing that, like, unfortunately, Disney is a brief footnote in her history. But I think,
Yeah.
like, the reason why she had to leave and everything, I just think it's really important to acknowledge that.
Very interesting.
This next woman is named Grace Huntington, and she is a story artist and an aviator, actually. She joined Disney's story department in 1936. Okay, this is so random. So she, like I said, she also was a pilot. She achieved a record altitude in her Taylorcraft light airplane of 24,310.975 feet in 1940. This is just her little side quest.
Yeah, okay.
But she was the second woman ever hired into Disney's lead animation department after Retta Scott. And the animation techniques that she actually created have been replicated globally.
Oh, I'm just gonna go break a flight record and then go be a very
But
prominent Disney animator. What the
it's
heck?
two crazy alternative lives here. It's amazing. But in her first days of Disney, she was the target of sexist harassment from her male coworkers who would often prevent her from entering story meetings. She recalled Walt Disney himself saying, "I would never consider hiring a woman for the animation department because when she was married, she'd be a total loss to the studio." At her initial hiring, she was an avid writer of short cartoons, and the animation concepts would become key to Mickey and Minnie Mouse cartoons, as well as the Silly Symphonies. After a few months of working for the studio, she gained credibility among her coworkers by being heavily involved in the creation and the design of characters and landscapes within Snow White. And then she quickly became an advocate for the hiring of other women, such as a woman named Dorothy Ann Blake, which is really
Mm.
cool. Her sketches of her time at Disney have been an inspiration for many, including ones of her going into a meeting with her coworkers in a full suit of armor. I don't know if that's true or if that was just a metaphorical, but I hope
Yeah.
it was true.
I wonder if our model for something or whatever, they're like, "Oh, we need some armor."
Yeah, I'm not sure. But there have been many books actually written about her time at Disney, such
Mm,
as They Drew as They Pleased, The Queens of Animation, and her own autobiography called Please Let Me Fly, which is really
love
cool.
that.
The next woman I'm going to talk about is Sylvia Holland, and she is a story artist and a composer, and she contributed to the Fantasia segment, The Nutcracker Suite, that kind of blended her musical and her artistic talents. She was born in the year 1900 and was a British born artist and was the second woman to become the storyboard artist for Walt Disney Productions. She worked for Disney in the 1930s and 40s and is, like I mentioned, especially known for her work on Fantasia.
Fantasia is such a pretty film.
It's such a beautiful film.
Yeah, like that beginning work, I feel like it just shines with a lot of
Mhm.
what Disney was doing in those early days.
Absolutely. She was actually the first woman to join the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1925 after she graduated from the Architectural Association School in 1919, which I thought was really cool. She moved to Canada where she joined the Architectural Institute of British Columbia. And then in 1928, she was actually pregnant with her son Boris. This is just like a sad story that kind of made sense as to how she ended up in California. She was pregnant at the time and she was traveling to England to see her parents and left her husband at home. While she was away, her husband developed a cold after some Christmas shopping and got a really bad ear infection that he later died from itis on December 28th.
Mastitis? Oh, it's an ear infection.
Yeah, that he actually died from a month before the birth of their son. And then the Great Depression happened right after. So the need for like architectural projects plummeted. So during the early 1930s, she moved her single parent household to a farm. And her son actually developed the same ailment as Frank. And so Sylvia was advised by a doctor to seek a drier climate.
Yeah.
So she moved her family to Los Angeles. But because she did not have an American degree, she couldn't practice as an architect in America.
Is
So
that still a
then
thing?
I'm not sure. It's pretty common, like even just like in the US, like you could get your like law license or even teaching license in certain states, but like different states have like
Yeah.
different
I knew
requirements.
with
So
licensing because they have different like laws and regulations, but
yeah,
I can't
I wouldn't.
imagine like moving to London and they're like, you can't be a graphic designer anymore.
Yeah, but I guess I wonder if like with architecture, if so much of it's about like,
Oh,
can
yeah,
you
that's a good
actually
point.
build buildings and make sure people won't
Yeah,
die?
because they probably have
I
different
don't know.
codes and regulations, and that's so interesting.
Right? But then, because she couldn't work as an architect, a year later she was hired as a sketch artist by Universal Studios on several movies such as 100 Men and a Girl that came out in 1937 and then Mad About Music in 1938. She saw Snow White in 1937 and she decided that she wanted to work for Walt Disney Productions. So, to gain more experience in animation, she worked as a cell inker for Walter Lantz Productions. And then by the summer of 1938, she had heard that Disney's next film after Pinocchio would be a concert film, Fantasia. She was really excited about this, so she applied to work for Disney and was granted an interview with Walt Disney. And on
Wow.
September 6th, she was hired and became the second woman hired into their story department. Because of her background as a musician and an artist, her first assignment was the Pastoral Symphony segment for Fantasia, and by December of 1938, she had been asked to supervise the Waltz of the Flowers segment of the Nutcracker Suite. After being partnered with Majoli and fellow sketch artist Ethel Kolsar, her responsibilities at Disney included story direction, concept, color studies, timing, and supervising other artists. Throughout her career at the Disney Studios, Walt Disney held her in high regard, noting that she was a highly talented artist with a marvelous sense of decoration and color who contributed immensely to the good taste and beauty of our productions. By April of 1940, Fantasia had been finished, and then Holland later developed the concept art on the Little April shower sequence for the 1942 film Bambi. By September of 1941, she had been laid off for that same strike thing, but she returned back in August of 1942 to develop storyboards on Victory Throughout Air Power. By early 1945, the Disney Studios had looked to salvage abandoned musical segments and combine them for the 1946 film Make Mine Music. And during production, she had written story treatments about Greek muses, which later became the Two Silhouettes sequence, which I thought was interesting. She was laid off from Disney again and briefly worked for Metro Goldwyn Mayer and MGM. And then she became a children's illustrator for Whitman Publishing, as well as worked as a greeting card designer for Macmillan's Readers and Kristen Limited Edition. So just
Wow.
a fun career as an artist, but I thought
Yeah.
her whole path to get her there to work for Disney in Fantasia and Bambi just was such an interesting turn of
So
events.
true. Gosh. Now I'm terrified about getting an ear infection and dying. I don't think that happens anymore,
I was going to
but
say, I think that being out of the 30s is what's helping us
can
here
you
with that.
imagine? You'd be so terrified every time you get sick. You get a cold and then you die.
Yeah, you have no
That'd be
idea.
awful.
No, literally.
Ugh.
The last two women I wanted to talk about are actually women who have worked in more recent years as directors in Disney animation. And the first woman I want to talk about is actually Brenda Chapman, who began her career at Disney and eventually became the first woman to direct a Pixar feature film or to be involved as a director with the movie Brave. She was born in 1962 and is an American animator, screenwriter, storyboard artist, and director. In 1998, she became the first woman to direct an animated feature from a major studio, DreamWorks, with the movie The Prince of Egypt.
Beautiful film.
That it is a beautiful film. And then in 2012, she directed the Pixar film Brave with Mark Andrews and co-direction from Steve Purcell, becoming the first woman to win the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. A little background with what she did with Disney. So in 1987, she graduated with a BFA in character animation and was hired as a story trainee on The Little Mermaid in 1989. She also worked as a storyboard artist on The Rescuers Down Under and Beauty and the Beast, where she worked closely with Rogers Allens to define many of the key sequences and motifs used in the film. And she later served as head of story, the first woman to do so in an animated feature film for The Lion King. Then she joined DreamWorks when it began in 1994 and was one of a team of 3 directors who worked on The Prince of Egypt and became the first female director for an animated feature by a major studio. There were other independent movies that had done that, but for a major studio, she was technically the first. She also worked on Chicken Run and several other projects with DreamWorks. And then in May 2003, Chapman and Allen were announced to direct Tam Lin, an adaptation of the Scottish folk ballad for Sony Pictures Animation. However, later that same year, she moved to Pixar after being initially invited by her old colleague, where she had a brief stint on Cars before developing The Bear and the Bow, which was eventually titled Brave.
Oh, I was gonna say Bear and Bow. Never heard of that one.
No. The bear,
Brave.
the mom, and then the bow.
That makes sense.
But they retitled it. In April of 2008, she was announced as the director of the film, making her Pixar's first female director. There seemed to have been some drama here because she was replaced by Mark Andrews following creative disagreements between her and John Lasseter. There
Huh.
were rumors that she left Pixar, but she remained on staff until after the film's release. In 2012, her work in Brave won her Academy Award, BAFTA, and the Golden Globe for Best Animated Feature Film, making her
Man.
the first woman to win this category. By July of 2012, she worked as a consultant at Lucasfilm Animation, helping to resolve story problems on Strange Magic. When asked, though, if she will return to Pixar, she responded by saying that she has no desire to go back there, feeling, quote, the atmosphere and the leadership doesn't fit well with me. Not really sure what all happened there, but still really cool that she was able to be
Yeah.
the first woman that was a part of that.
And it's some really monumental films. Like, imagine being
Truly.
trained on The Little
The Little
Mermaid and
Mermaid,
then working with Beauty and the Beast and The
The
Lion
Lion
King.
King. It's
Like,
incredible.
yeah, very distinguished resume for sure.
Absolutely. The last woman that I want to talk about is Jennifer Lee, who is the first woman to direct a Walt Disney Animation Studios feature film, none other than Frozen. Probably one
Which,
of the
oh
biggest
my gosh, it
Disney
took them
films of all
until
time.
Frozen for them to
Yeah.
get a female director.
What's also cool
But
is that
yeah.
she co-wrote both Frozen
Mhm.
1 and 2. Also became the chief creative officer at Walt Disney in 2018.
I mean,
Anyways,
like, how could you not? You create
after-
Frozen and they're like,
yeah,
okay,
we trust you.
here you go. You can do whatever you want now.
Yeah. And I think she only
Yeah.
did that until 2024. She stepped down as the CCO to go back to making movies again.
Nice.
But of course, she is best known as the writer and one of the directors of Frozen and the sequel, and the former of which, Frozen, earned her Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, and then became the first female CCO of Walt Disney Animation Studios. She was also, of course, that first female director of 2 feature films that each earned more than $1 billion in gross box office revenue, which is cool.
It
Yeah,
still
just
makes a lot of
incredible.
money every year, I'm sure.
Yeah. There's so much more I could have gone in,
Yeah.
with her life, but like she's still in her career. So it's like hard to tie a bow on someone's life that's like still developing.
No, definitely.
But in March of 2011, Phil Johnston, who was a former classmate of hers at Columbia, called her to ask to join him at Disney Animation in Burbank to help him write Wreck-It Ralph, which is a great Disney movie.
Yes.
It was supposed to be a temporary 8-week writing gig that eventually turned into a much longer commitment. First, she was asked to stay on until Ralph was finished, and then she became involved with Frozen, initially as a screenwriter and later a director alongside Chris Buck. When Lee was brought on board, she helped transition the film from an action adventure to more musical with more comedy. And she worked
thank
closely with
heavens.
this. I know, literally, thank goodness. She worked closely with the songwriters, who are Robert Lopez and Kristen Anderson Lopez, in the writing of the script. And Frozen gave her the opportunity to celebrate wild and wonderful girls like her childhood self and her daughter, Agatha. What's I think so cool is that she drew inspiration from her life. She inspired Frozen from her relationship with her sister, Amy, which, like,
Aw.
that's why it's touching, is because
Yeah,
it's literally from life.
cute.
Connecting the script to real life, she referred to herself as the wild little daydreaming mess, a Tasmanian devil, and Amy was always the responsible one, straight A student. So she, of course, identifies with Kristen Bell's Anna and not Idina Menzel's Elsa.
Yeah.
What is really cool is I love this quote from her. Just to end the episode, I think it ties a nice bow on everything. But she said, "If I learned one thing, it is that self-doubt is one of the most destructive forces. It makes you defensive instead of open, reactive instead of active. Self-doubt is consuming and cruel, and my hope today is that we can all collectively agree to ban it. Please know from here on out, you are enough, and dare I say, more than enough."
I love
And I
that.
thought that was just a portion of, I think, a
Yeah.
whole commitment speech that she gave. But
That's so
yeah,
good.
incredible work. Just casually Frozen.
Yeah.
Just
Just
some
casually.
small little Disney film, whatever. That didn't do anything.
Oh my gosh, the hold that it had on society for
Yeah.
like a decade.
That
I
movie
think
was so big that it like infiltrated the Billboard charts with Let It Go. Like that
Yes,
doesn't happen very often.
No, I think the last time they had Disney movies on the charts was like Phil Collins' Tarzan.
And since then, the only time was We Don't Talk About Bruno from Encanto,
Oh
which was
yeah,
a great movie.
Yeah, another
And a great
major
But
moment.
since then, not really.
It doesn't happen super often. Beauty and the Beast, the live action, the song that Josh Groban sang for that was
Oh, really?
also on the charts. Phenomenal. You really should see that one. I think you would enjoy it.
I don't know why I never sought it out. Maybe I should.
The song's
But
very
yeah.
good though.
So yeah, those are just some of the lives of the women in the early animator days, storyboard days, but also some that are still currently working on cool
Yeah.
things and still breaking records, which is just
Oh,
crazy, like you said.
definitely. I think there's no denying that women have always been a very large part of Disney, even behind the screen. So the
Yeah.
ones we've done an episode on the voices behind the Disney princesses of
Mm-hmm.
the voice actors that brought all of these characters to life and like
Yep.
so many more roles. Like
Absolutely.
such a large institution.
Such a large company. Anyway, thanks for joining us today. Hope you learned more and felt inspired by the stories of women artists from the past. And we'll be back next week, of course. So come
Yes.
say hi on Instagram in the meantime. Comment, leave us a review.
And don't forget, we still got merch on our website. So we have
We're
the
gonna keep that there for a
hoodies, the
while.
sweatshirts. I cannot emphasize enough how comfortable these hoodies are, you
No,
guys.
they're really
Like,
great. We did good. I won't lie.
yes, they are phenomenal. And so far, actually, the company we work with, that we do print on demand, obviously, it's easier for us. They have not had any effects from tariffs yet. So I don't know how they're like swimming in that situation, but go purchase now because
Just in
I don't
case.
know
Yeah.
if we'll have to raise prices or not.
Good point.
Very,
Great
very good
company,
work.
too.
However, I do not want to have to charge all of you
Even more.
195%. So if you've been eyeing one, like now is the time because I don't know what's going to happen with that.
Valid.
Yeah.
Awesome. We will be back next Monday.
Yes, we will. Bye.